you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Courtney Tedrick, Community Engagement Department Head of Wheaton Public Library. Tonight, we're going to learn how you can be your child's academic advocate, and we are thrilled to be welcoming our speaker, Matthew Patton from New Day Counseling. Before transitioning into counseling, Matthew Patton spent 10 years in the public school system as both a teacher and special education director. Drawing on his extensive background in education, he now partners with families to identify their child's unique special education needs and empowers them to effectively advocate for the support and services their child requires within complex school systems. Matthew specializes in treating ADHD, autism, trauma, anxiety, depression, and provides academic and special education support, collaboration, and advocacy. With that, I will hand it over to you, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, thanks for having me. Thanks for the great introduction. So let me get this going here so everybody can see it. So here's our presentation for tonight. As Courtney already said, being your child's advocate, navigating special ed and Section 504, and supporting your child in school. And I say child to include everyone essentially in public schools, K-12 settings. And so here's a little bit of what we'll go over. If you guys, I know talking is kind of limited, so I have a little activity, but you can just type your answers and we can check them, or Courtney can read them off to me. So after we go through that, we'll go through what's the difference between special ed and Section 504. We'll go through some of like the similarities and differences between IEPs and 504 plans and like the overall process of how they work from a very broad perspective. We're not going to get into too much detail. Don't want to overwhelm anybody. And then we'll go through some parent and student rights for each one, and then kind of how you can be and balance being an active team member and also sort of holding the school and everyone accountable in like a positive way to make sure that we are supporting all of our students how they need to be. And so for about me, really quickly, and like who am I and why should you care, essentially. Courtney already did a great job at kind of like giving you the resume highlights and everything in terms of the additional stuff on there. I also do some volunteer work with some of those agencies underneath. So I do search and rescue instruction for Will County and DuPage counties. And I've taught classes about lost persons behaviors for people with various types of disabilities. I do disaster mental health for the Red Cross when I can. If anybody remembers Highland Park, I was there for that. And then I was part of a therapy dog team where my dog and I visit schools and hospitals and libraries and all of those places. That was a lot of fun. And so here's the highlights, I guess, the things that you might care more about, as this is the family. And so it's 3 boys under 5, and then the dog is as crazy as that picture makes him look, believe me. So that's what we got going on in the day-to-day in the house. And if you can type it in the little chat boxes or something. You don't have to put your names if you don't want to. I can see some of them, but your job or your role, where you work, or if you're in schools especially, and like sort of what interested you about the presentation or the overall topic about special ed or anything like that. And I can give you guys a minute to do that. Here you go, Courtney's already putting up there for you. So go ahead and feel free to type what you want or nothing if you don't want to. Okay, great. I can see Rosemary. And there's Sarah. Sarah is our director of our Glen Ellen location. She's great. Thanks, Rosemary. Getting a 504 for the first time, that can be an overwhelming process for some people, especially if you're not familiar with it for sure. Other people can kind of enter as they want. I don't want to hold this up for too long or anything. Um, and so here's something else. If you like, I want you to figure out which one of these is sort of the most important for learning. We have the intention or desire to learn. We have paying close attention to the material as you study. We have learning in a way that aligns with your learning style or combination thereof, and the amount of time you spend studying. Give people a minute if they want to answer. But overall, this is a little bit of a trick question because it's none of these things. It is actually what you think about while you study. None of the other stuff matters as much as what you think about while you study and the connections that you create between yourself and your lived experiences, and the meaning that you give to the material while you're doing it. And if you didn't get it right, don't worry, nobody does. None of my college students get it right unless they guess. And they're all surprised. And so how this works, and we'll go through this really fast. This was the experimental design. And so they basically put a bunch of people into different groups here, and they gave them a random list of words. And the control group was just told, learn the words however you want. The intentional group, who was warned that there's going to be a quiz at the end, they were given two strategies. And then the unintentional group, who was not warned about the quiz at the end, were also given the same two strategies. One was checking for ease in the words, and then the other one was creating like a pleasantness rating of some kind, how much you enjoyed whatever that word happened to be. And the group that did the best was group 4 down in the bottom right, and group 2. They both did well. And a lot of what that shows is, well, it doesn't matter if you were warned about the quiz or you weren't warned about the quiz, or if you wanted to use some sort of like surface level way, or if you were just told learn it however you want. What mattered is how you connected your life to it, and how that sort of deep level of processing is what they ended up calling it. And that overcame everything else. It didn't matter even if you intended to learn or not, you still ended up doing it. And so the whole point of this for our special ed and 504 students, is that we want to make sure that we are supporting them in learning and accessing material in the way that they best do so, or the multiple ways that they best do so. And so if we talk about sort of what the difference is here, on the left we have special ed, and on the right is 504, and in the middle we've got both. So very briefly, special ed is under IDEA and overseen by the Department of Education, whereas Section 504 was authorized under the Rehabilitation Act, and it's overseen by the Office of Civil Rights and Health and Human Services. For special ed, you have to fit within one of 13 disability categories, whereas for 504, any disability can qualify as long as you can say it impairs a major life activity. And they're very broad definitions of what that is. For special ed, they want to provide specialized instruction and includes goals and progress monitoring. They're re-evaluated every 3 years, but then every year you'll have an annual, but it's not re-evaluation. It's sort of just updating it. And schools receive funding for all the special ed stuff. Special ed teachers are government funded or federally funded and everything. Whereas for 504, we focus on learning and access. So this also includes if you have a wheelchair or crutches temporarily or something, or if you need some support getting from one place to another, things like that. And then it also provides civil rights protections for those people with whatever sort of disability would qualify. And what they share is that they have to be provided by all public schools. That is the law. They provide academic and access accommodations. They require parental input and consent. They're reviewed annually, and they can include, I have RSP, you'll see that throughout here, that's related service providers. So that's psychologists, social workers, nurses, things like that. And they'll include all those evaluations. They don't cost any money to the families. And they include transition services. So whenever a student is transitioning from elementary to middle school to high school, or high school beyond, they'll include some sort of transition support and services. And for all of them, you have a right to have an advocate at the meetings that you attend, which is part of the services that I provide. Now, for both of them, a little bit more about their definition of disability and the supports that they offer. So for special ed, these are the 13 categories. So there's autism, deaf, blind, just deaf, visual, hearing, intellectual disabilities, emotional disabilities, specific learning disabilities, speech and language, traumatic brain injuries. OHI is other health impairment. They can lump a lot of different things in there, including ADHD. An orthopedic or multiples includes more than one of those things. For Section 504, we said it significantly limits an important life event, and learning is an important life event under Section 504. In terms of how they support, this is where one of the biggest differences you'll see between the two. I'll start. 504 allows access to academic and extracurricular activities that may otherwise be inaccessible. So some of that is a 504 can get you textbooks at home, and at school, it can get you, instead of a written schedule, a picture schedule, it can get them transportation services from home to school, things like that. For IEPs, they provide more than that for the material, but they don't provide that sort of like physical access to things. So they do two things. They do modifications, which is like the what students are learning to the curriculum and instruction, and then accommodations, which is how they learn those things for the existing curriculum. Accommodations are generally the easier way to go, and that's also what 504 plans can do, is they can adjust the how students learn. So they can go into, well, instead of writing an essay, you can write a paragraph. Instead of doing 10 math questions, you can do 5 math questions. Instead of having like a standard or random seat in the room, you can have preferential seating. Maybe it's near the teacher, maybe it's near the door, maybe it's near a window or something like that. Or they can adjust the type of seating you have. Like some kids they want to sit on the chairs with balls in them, or they want the bands on their chair legs, or the Velcro under their desk, or whatever it might be. That's all accommodations. Modifications, which is only available through an IEP, change the curriculum and instruction themselves. So 504 doesn't do this. And so this is the what kids learn. And so modifications can include not just like changing how the material is presented, or the amount of material that you might have to do. It is changing the material itself. It is adjusting the grade criteria or the measurement criteria themselves. It is adjusting the timelines or the level of support from various staff members that students get, things like that. That's modifying the curriculum and or the instruction itself. And that's done not to like just make it easier, is what some people see when they hear that. It's more of having it so it aligns better with that student's unique abilities. So regardless of grade or subject, we want to make sure that that material, while still rigorous, is within their reach and not too far beyond it. to make it so they can never achieve it. We want to make sure it's within that zone that like challenges them, but also helps them be successful. Um, and then for team members from the schools, these are very similar. They differ in essentially who's in charge of it. And so for special ed, you'll have the case manager, which for most districts will be a district level position. When you get to high school, sometimes the buildings will have a designated case manager, or maybe even two if you're in a really big building, like the Naperville campuses or Downers Grove. Whereas the 504 will have a 504 coordinator, which is typically also a district level position outside of the high school settings. High schools can have maybe a designated 504 coordinator. And then for special ed, you'll also have obviously the special ed teachers involved. Sometimes, usually there's only one, sometimes there's more than one, depending on the needs. And then they both have those related service providers and gen ed teachers involved. And then essentially how this all goes for a lot of this is in terms of like staffing and who you might see at a meeting and all of these things, it can be a lot to keep track of. If you've ever seen the cover sheet of an IEP, they have probably enough space for 15 or 20 people to write their names down. But they all have titles underneath, and that can be really useful for knowing not just the name of the person that was there, but the role that they're playing in that specific meeting. And so for both special ed and 504, you'll see I have they're led kind of in quotes by these people. So led by the case manager and led by the 504 coordinator. I use it very loosely because while they are typically ultimately the person who like shapes the pace of the meeting or presents a lot of the overall content of the meeting and who is responsible, he's probably your point of contact. You're going to be one of them. The both meetings are very collaborative or should be very collaborative. And so nobody's really in charge. Everyone is equal. And that includes all of these people that are in these lists. So all of the related service providers. Typically, you're not going to have a psychologist or a counselor involved in a 504 plan, but otherwise we share all of these other people. So teachers, social workers, OTs, PTs, nurses, speech path. If you have an advocate or if there's a community agency, like a Department of Rehabilitation Services or something like that. And then a transition rep. So sometimes a high school counselor or something like that will come to a middle school IEP meeting to help transition that student from middle school to high school. And so while all of these people are involved and they all sound sometimes intimidating, especially when you're sitting at a table surrounded by all of these people, parents and the family and the students are all equal team members to all of these people. And that's really important to remember, so much so that I pointed out like this. So both parents and students are equally important as anyone on that list in terms of how the meetings are run, the pace that they go, asking questions, being informed, and ultimately determining what ends up in the document itself. Everybody has an equal collaborative say. And so when your students are old enough, typically late elementary school or so, maybe like fourth grade, fifth grade, they can go to the meetings. They can go at any time. But before that, they're not necessarily going to get a lot out of it. They're going to be bored most of the time. But after that, when they have the knowledge to understand a lot of what's going on, they have a say. This is about them. And so the parents and their preferences and the student and their preferences all have as much of a say as anybody else on that list. And so the process, I call it the IEP process because it's more complicated for IEPs and 504s, but they share a lot of this is overlap for them. And so for the IEP process, first step is that you request an evaluation. You can do this at any time. Even if you had one done last week, you can ask for it again. Same is true for 504 plans. You can request an evaluation whenever you want. The trick is that you got to do it in writing. And you'll see that kind of throughout a lot of this process. And I emphasize that almost more than any other part of this. When I was case managing, you would operate under the rule that if it wasn't in writing, it didn't happen, both for the school or for the family. So you want to make sure that whatever you're doing, even if it's a phone call or something like that, followed up with an email. It has to be in writing. Um, so much so that I would tell parents or other case managers or my special ed teachers, like if I wasn't there and a parent requested an evaluation or a meeting or something, it has to be in writing. But I don't care. That doesn't have to be an email. Have them write it on a piece of paper. That's fine. Then give it to me. If they don't write or speak English, it doesn't matter. The language is not specified. Write it in whatever language they speak or write. That's totally fine, as long as it is in writing. That's what counts. And then in terms of following that, you have the school's decision. So the district and the parents will meet to determine if an evaluation should proceed. And then the school between steps 1 and 2 there has 14 days to decide yes or no, essentially. Um, they typically go with yes, but every now and then you get a no, we're not going to do this. And they have to have a really good reason for doing that. Um, so we'll make sure that they justify themselves in that choice, because as the parent, if you requested that, you think your kid needs it. And if you think your kid needs it, there's a very good chance that they do. And so if a school says no, which again, they rarely do, they have to justify it very thoroughly. Following that, you have it's technically 2 meetings, but there's a domain meeting and then a consent meeting, but they're typically held back to back. These are very short. It's just the parents and case manager and maybe a special ed teacher meeting with the related service providers, if there's a social worker or a psychologist or a nurse involved. And they have their descriptions of here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to do it, and then the parent signs off on, yeah, that's okay. I give my consent for you guys to do all of those things. And then the school district has 60 school days, period. They can finish sooner. They cannot take longer to complete all of their evaluations from those related service providers, but also to hold the evaluation and eligibility determination meetings, and then ultimately the IEP meeting. 60 days is the law. And then we'll get into a little bit about like law versus reality. We would love if the law was super accurate and meshed really well with what actually happens in real life and in schools and in homes, but it doesn't always do that. And so following that up, at sometime within the 60 days, they'll have an eligibility determination meeting. And this is ultimately like all of the service providers and the teachers collected all of their data and they write up reports. And then they say, okay, as a team, do we think this student qualifies for something under section 504 or for special ed, and under which category? And all of that, the trick before this too, as a parent, is that all of the documents that they will use for this meeting and then the IEP meeting, which is typically held the same day, if not immediately after. It's just more convenient for everybody because the eligibility can go relatively quickly. In Illinois, every state is different, but in Illinois, every single document that they plan to use, that the school plans to use at these meetings, must be provided to the family a minimum of 3 school days prior to the meetings. At one point it was 5, at one point it was 10, and 10 was kind of too difficult for a lot of districts or schools. And so currently the law is 3 days, and that's the minimum, is 3 school days prior. So that's all of the related service provider write-ups and assessments. That's all of the eligibility determination and a draft of the IEP itself in its entirety. They can't leave parts out, because then they're not giving you all of the documentation that you might need to be prepared for the meeting. And that's one, it's not legal, but also it's not really fair, and kind of it can inhibit the family's ability to participate in the meeting in a meaningful way. And so then once the IEP meetings are held, they complete that. Um, this can kind of go back and forth sometimes during the meetings. There can be a lot of adjustments to the IEP or the 504 plan itself. That's very normal. If there's like a goal written in the IEP and that wants to be adjusted somehow, or if there's a support somehow from the 504 IEP that wants to be added or modified or something, that's totally normal. And that's part of what the meetings are for. And then once that's all done and the parents sign off on, yes, we agree that this IEP is great, it can be finalized, and then placement happens after that. So placement in the LRE, which is least restrictive environment, which is just like we would love for every special ed and 504 student to be in an inclusive classroom setting. Not all of them, that's not their best place for success necessarily, but we don't want to put a student in a setting that is overly restrictive. We want them to be in that least restrictive, that most inclusive setting. That's what that means. And so after that IEP meeting, the parents have the option of waiving this 10-day waiting period after you give consent and sign off on that IEP. Otherwise, the school district will wait 10 school days to implement whatever you see in the document. Most families typically waive it, but not always, and you don't have to do that. And so the big roles for parents and even students who are old enough, come prepared with questions, come prepared with input. If you want something changed, or if you want something added, or something taken away, or if you have a question about how something would work, or why is something structured a certain way or written a certain way, come prepared with those. I'm a big fan of writing them down so we don't forget. Those meetings can be kind of overwhelming, especially if you're not used to going to them. Write them down, come prepared with them, and then make sure we're recording answers to those so that they're satisfactory for you. And if they're not, we can keep asking. And we want this to be very collaborative. We want everyone to be on the same page and be comfortable with how it all works and what the final result is. And so what happens after all of that? So if you waived it, or after 10 days, that student is placed in whatever LRE was determined appropriate for them. And then the accommodations and or modifications follow that. So once they're placed, they'll receive both of those as described in the document, and the school will also start collecting data and tracking goals, or in a 504 plan, there's not goals, but they'll start tracking, is this helpful? Is this effective, sort of thing. And then on in an ongoing fashion, information is communicated from the school to the family, and vice versa as well. It's very open dialogue, ideally. And so as goals progress and they're monitored and evaluated to see how effective are they, how helpful are they, that's communicated home. And so we want to make sure that these students are getting not only what they need to be successful, but also that those things are actually helpful. Because it's, we have a pretty good idea, but not everything works for every student. We want it to be as uniquely tailored to them as it can be. And some of the tricky parts with this are some schools will say to a family, for example, like, here is our sort of menu of available accommodations or modifications. Let's go through and see what would be useful for the student. And that sounds great. And a lot of times that is mostly appropriate. But the law, this is where the law and the real world don't always align. The law says that process should be reversed. The law says that whatever the student needs to be successful, that is what the school or district gives them. It is not the other way around. If they need it, they get it. Doesn't matter if the school can provide it or not. If they need it and it ends up in the IEP or the 504, it is the school's responsibility and legal obligation at that point to provide that. When I was working for Chicago Public Schools, the sort of outlandish example that I remember being given was that if the IEP team determines that this student would benefit from having a therapy horse with them and that ends up in the IEP, then it is that school's responsibility to give that student a therapy horse. Doesn't matter if they don't have a horse, they better get one or find a way to provide that student with those services somehow, because once it's there, that's it. You got to do it. And that's the process we want to go through, is not what does the school have that might be helpful. It's what does the student need? And then the school provides that. And so in terms of who you would expect communication from, um, communication ultimately is the responsibility of the case manager, the special ed teacher, and or the 504 coordinator. It is not ultimately the responsibility of the gen ed teacher. This gets a little blurry in elementary school sometimes because the gen ed teacher is often with the student for a lot more time. But ultimately, it's not their responsibility to communicate anything home to the family about special ed or 504 related items. And it is the responsibility, usually the special ed teacher, whoever's caseload that student is on, that special ed teacher will typically be your first line of communication about how is this going? Oh, hey, they struggled on this test or assignment. I wonder if they got, the supports that were in their IEP or their 504 or something like that. That's typically the responsibility of the special ed teacher or the 504 coordinator if it's a 504 plan. And so we don't want to go this route, but within the parent and student rights, in terms of formal conflict resolution, we have a few strategies that are in place to help parents and students navigate what can be really complicated and to help hold the schools and districts accountable ultimately. Your first one is mediation, and this is a formal legal process with an assigned mediator, typically from the state board, and whatever sort of agreement is worked out through that mediation process between the school or district and the family is legally binding after that sort of process. You can also file a complaint with the state board in writing, and they have like online forms you can fill out or you can mail them in, however you want to do it. You can also take a school or district to what's called due process. It's essentially taking the district or school to court over violating special ed or 504 law or your students' rights. And you also have the right to what's called an IEE or an independent educational evaluation. This is typically for if a psychologist, say, or a social worker or someone like that evaluates the student and the family disagrees with the results of that evaluation. The family has the right to an independent evaluation at the district's expense. The parents do not have to pay for that. You have the right to that evaluation, that outside independent evaluation paid for by the district. And there's steps to go through for all of these things. And so when do we utilize these? When do we want to use them? Really, we never want to use them. We always want to try to talk things out. A lot of this, the difficulties come from where the law says this is how you have to do it, but then that meets with like the real world logistics of a school and a district. Some schools they don't have the staff that they might want to have to support all of their students. And a lot of them, they're just doing their best and doing everything they can. And some things are going to fall through the cracks. And if we can talk about them and bring it up in like a cordial way, but still firm way, usually we can find a resolution for things like that. These options are more for when the district or the school ultimately disagrees with what the parents or student want. And so I have language in here like when you disagree with the evaluation and they refuse to do a re-evaluation. That's very rare. But in that instance, you would have the right to say, okay, we're going to get an independent evaluation, and the district will pay for that. Um, if they, if the district kind of doesn't adhere to some of those timeline and those legal steps that we outlined earlier, you can pursue these options if you like. Typically, if there are issues, it's around the timing. It's maybe the district didn't complete everything within the 60-day window. And that can be for a myriad of reasons. Maybe their psychologists or social workers were sick or on leave or something like that and couldn't get them done in time. Um, there are forms that they can fill out to say, hey, parents, is it okay if we extend this deadline? And that's usually what they'll do just so they have that in writing. Again, that's how important it is. But sometimes there might not be really a great reason. And that's where families have this option to make sure, like, hey, the law says we have this within this timeline. Um, and then that last one too, if the teachers or the school either doesn't or refuse to, which again, that refuses especially is very, very rare, to provide or implement the services as they are described in the IEP or 504 plan. Um, they almost never refuse to do it because it was part of their idea in the first place. They agreed to it. But sometimes the IEP or the 504, a support in there, maybe even a handful of supports or something like that just doesn't align well with the structure of the school in some way. And so logistical things can kind of butt heads with some of the legal side. But most, if not almost all schools and districts are very open to like working on that between them and the family. No district or school wants to be taken to due process or go through mediation or have a complaint filed against them with the state. Nobody wants that. Parents and families don't want to have to do it, and the school or district doesn't want that to happen to them. And so it's beneficial to, start out in some of the more informal, like, hey, I just noticed this was happening. Um, this isn't what's in the IEP or the 504. What can we do about it? Um, and so that's the route we want to go. We don't want to take the formal resolution options, but that's why they're there, is that last sort of line of, we are one family in a district of hundreds or thousands of families. What sort of power do we have? You have this. That's what that's there for. And then in terms of attending meetings, when I ask this question, I say, well, like, which meetings can you go to? Which meetings can parents go to? Which meetings can students go to? And the answer for this question, I emphasize it this much, is all of them. You have the right to attend every single one. Sometimes it's not logistically possible to attend them in person. Great. Do what we're doing right now. Have a virtual meeting. Maybe that's not possible. Have it on the phone. Talk to them on the phone. Be on speaker while they're having this meeting. You can participate in any method like that you want, and you have every right, whether you're the parent or the student, to attend every single meeting that is related to your special ed or your 504 plan. And so when we are there, what do we want to do? We already said we want to come with questions. We want to have input ready to go. We want that for sure. You have parents especially have valuable insight into how their student behaves outside of school. That the school doesn't have that. And so you can provide a lot of context for things that the school might not have. You have a lot of strengths and difficulties in extracurriculars or and like private club type activities that maybe the school doesn't offer or something that might be helpful. As the parents, you also get to speak on behalf of your student if they're not there or if they're not comfortable or able to advocate for themselves. You can do that. And then you want to collaborate with all of the other IEP or 504 team members, ask those questions, and ultimately provide that final approval of those documents. If you are the student and you feel comfortable, you get to advocate for yourself. Show up and say, I don't want this, or I do want this, or hey, could we change this or something? Or can I have this goal modified in this way? Advocate for those things. Ask questions, be informed. And then a lot of it too is going home and talking to parents about, hey, this is how this has been going, right? They've given me these sorts of supports or these accommodations, and they've been helpful, or maybe they actually haven't been as helpful as we thought they would be. Or maybe like, hey, I had this test and like I didn't have access to one of these accommodations for whatever reason, and it was really hard, and I don't think I did very well, sort of deal. And that case, that's like that gives the parents an opportunity to follow up with that case manager or special ed teacher or 504 coordinator. Say, hey, my kid told me this. Can you tell me more about that? Can you fill me in on why they didn't get this support? Because they really struggled. And maybe there's a perfectly valid reason for it. But either way, they get to try again with that support. That's what the documents are there for. But you don't get this if you don't actively participate. So, the school does a lot of work up front for all of this, and they do a lot of work every day to maintain all of these things and to adhere to what's inside of them. And so it's the parents and the families and the students' responsibility to do their part as well. It's a very collaborative effort. It takes, the phrase "it takes a village," it really does. It takes everybody doing their part for these things. And so ultimately, the 504 or IEP process itself, all the things that we've talked about so far, is the easier part. The hard part for the school, especially, is tracking, implementing, monitoring, and reporting on all of the things that are inside the documents, especially IEPs. Tracking data for goals in a formal, structured way, tracking how well supports accommodations actually work. How do they help that student or don't help that student in the classroom and various different classrooms during different types of assignments or interactions with other students? There's a lot of data collection that goes on almost every day for all of these things. And so getting and writing an IEP or 504 is often the easier part. This part is a lot harder. And for the parents to help advocate both for yourselves, but also your student, know who to reach out to when you have a question or a concern, especially if your student comes home and says, hey, I usually get this thing, but I didn't get it. And I really struggled with something. Great. Ask that question. Usually you're going to direct that towards the special ed teacher or the 504 coordinator, but it helps to know who all of these people are. And you should meet them at the meetings, but also, if you're just starting a 504 or IEP for the first time, you might not know. And districts don't always make it easy to know who to reach out to from the get-go. A lot of districts kind of call their the person who is in charge of special ed or 504 stuff. Every district is different, a different title. Some will have assistant superintendent in the title. Some will have director or something in the title. Some don't even have either of those. And so just the key point is don't let that stop you. Reach out to whoever you think is appropriate or ask your students' gen ed teacher, their classroom teacher, hey, who should I reach out to for this? Hopefully they can direct you in the right way. Anyone you reach out to ultimately will help you get to the person that it needs to get to. It's just not always easy. And then frequently check in with your child to discuss like all of the interventions and things that we've talked about and how well they work or don't work. And then I'm a big fan of being curious, but being firm, right? We don't want to go in with any assumptions. We don't want to come in too hot. We want to make sure that we're curious, we're asking questions, but also we're sticking to what we want and what we think is best for our student. And so you want to make sure all of that communication is in writing and ask a lot of questions before we try to judge anything or any teacher, especially. And then, along that vein, comparing what the school says. Hey, here's how the progress towards this goal is going. Here's how we know. Hey, here's how well or not well this support works. And compare that to what your child says. And that'll give you a good understanding and give you information and a place to start with. Hey, can we modify some of this? It looks like some of this isn't working how we thought it would. Can we change it? You can always ask to change it at any time. And so this is how I how I represent this. If you're a Ted Lasso fan, that's who that one is on the left. We want to go in curious and not judgmental. The T and the pinky are optional. Um, I'm a fan of the mustache, though, if you didn't tell. But inside, you can have all of the rage and fury you want because you are a parent advocating for your child. Um, but you won't win a lot of hearts and minds that way. So we want to make sure that we're curious and where we are keeping that sort of that that anger or defensiveness of our kid that we might feel inside and trying to reach a mutually beneficial solution between us and the school itself because ultimately they are the ones that have to carry it out. So we want everybody to be on the same team, and so that's why we want to really stay here. That's the goal. And we hopefully it's not just on the parents or the family to be this way. Your school staff should be this way as well, right? If they see that something's not working for that student, we want to figure out why. If a special ed teacher goes into a classroom and sees that one of their students isn't getting the accommodations that they're supposed to get, from whatever that content or gen ed teacher is. Okay, well, let's figure that out. Let's see what's going on before we get too outwardly aggressive or judgmental. And it can be hard, but that's where we want to stay. And then we're getting towards the end here. So, in terms of supports in the classroom, this is one of the things that can be sent out to you guys after we're done, so you don't have to worry about like writing this down or remembering it or anything like that. Um, but in the classroom, these are all options. So like preferential seating, you know, by the teacher or away from distractions near a door or a window, or like supportive peers or in a small group sort of arrangement, for cues or reminders, especially for our little ADHD kids. Having desk notes or visual timers or transition prompts, not just between classes, but also between assignments. Um, if there's an accessibility option, having those minute or 5 minute passes or an elevator pass or something between classes, letting them kind of go out in the hallway a little bit earlier than all of the other kids. So it's easier for them to not get distracted or to not get overwhelmed or anxious. And then sometimes a hallway buddy. Yeah, you can have a buddy with you who's maybe just more confident about navigating all of that stuff through the hallway, especially if it's an elementary student just going to middle school or a middle school student just going to high school. That can be very overwhelming for some students. In terms of supporting regulation, all sorts of fidgets or breaks, bathroom stuff, books or reading or movement breaks, emotion supports, regulation supports, sensory things, all sorts of stuff with opportunities for regulation. OTs are your school OT is a really good place for all of the sorts of like options for fidgety things that your student might need. And then understanding material, having additional time or wait time, breaking directions down from maybe a small paragraph into these very clear single step directions, having directions both verbally and in writing, or maybe in writing and in pictures, even. Having check ins from the staff, not just at the beginning and at the end of class, but maybe throughout, even. Having them partnered with an academically strong peer, or using closed versus open ended questions, and like following their ability with Bloom's sorts of verbs that, if you're in education or you're familiar with all of that, is aligning it to where our students tend to be can be helpful. And in terms of work, giving partial credit, giving them attempts to show what they know, or changing the format of it even. Oh, instead of, typing out an essay, you can handwrite something. Even in my college classes, I'm a big fan of, yeah, you can write a paper if you want. If that's your jam, write the paper. I've had students do dioramas. I've had students draw comic strips. And I've had students do original art paintings, both actual physical paintings and on computers and things like that. It's not about can you show what you learn in this specific way. It's showing that you learned what we wanted you to learn. It doesn't matter how. And so sometimes just kind of aligning that better with their abilities can be helpful. Um, and so sometimes also that's if there's a long-term project, well, let's put some artificial deadlines in there. Let's break it up into smaller pieces, into smaller chunks for them, or giving maybe a study guide or an outline where maybe other students don't get that. Um, and then for behavior, we can have specialized PBIS's behavior intervention, or like check-in, check-outs, or picture choices. If they struggle with thinking of a certain word in certain situations, or um, maybe they're an English language learner and as part of that, they struggle with vocabulary or something. Okay, give them pictures. Let them tell you what they want that way. And then organization for all of our disorganized students. Um, give them scheduled time to reorganize their stuff. Have them dump out those backpacks full of crumpled paper and week old sandwiches that are half eaten and get it all out. Give them picture examples of what an organized locker or desk or backpack looks like. Give them an organizer inside of their locker if you can. Give them binders or extra planners or assignments or graphic organizers or whatever is supportive for them. And these aren't even a small portion of what is available. There's so much more. I just didn't want to go too overboard with it. And then in terms of testing, a lot of that is still also available, but we want to make sure that we can give it where it is appropriate. So a lot of the time it's in a small group or a separate setting so that we can read the directions aloud or the whole test aloud or check in or if a student struggles to write, they can have a scribe write for them. They can do speech to text software or they can type it or something. They can have extended time. They can demonstrate their learning over multiple days instead of all at once. Let them take breaks. Let them have a visual timer. Don't even time them at all if it's not that important. Um, you can change the structure or the content instead of multiple choice or fill in the blank or matching or anything. Change it to whatever is more supportive of their actual abilities. If it's paper or on a computer, it can be the opposite. You can reduce test items or item answers. You can give them choices where maybe they weren't before, all sorts of options for that. Um, Standardized test, I have an asterisk there. That's your MAP testing, your ACT, SAT, your IAR testing, all of those sorts of things. There's so many of them. Um, the accommodations that are allowed for standardized tests are determined by the testing company and not by the district or the school. And those companies have to approve those accommodations prior to the test date. They usually have a cutoff. And so in that case, it's usually the case manager, but it can be the special ed teacher, 504 coordinator as well, has to submit all of the documentation that says, yes, here is what this student needs, here's why they need it for this test. And then that company has to approve it. So those support options can be much more limited for those sorts of things. And then these are resources that will also be handed out or like be emailed out, I suppose. And so ISB, the State Board of Education, has what's called their Parent Guide to Special Ed. It's great at distilling information down into as simple as you can make it at least document. Same thing for their laws, regulation, and guidance document. There's a lot of it, and they break it down as much as they can. The HHS has their 504 fact sheet, which is very similar to ISB's. And then the Department of Ed also has their Section 504 document on there as well. And then that's all I have. So ready for questions if you guys have any. I hope you do. I know there are some probably around, so feel free to ask them. I'm happy to answer as best as I can, or at least like point you in the right direction if I don't have something explicitly for you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was such great information because I know it's a lot. So if anyone has any questions, you can drop them in the Q&A or the chat. I'll keep an eye on both. One thing I was wondering, is it I heard, is it true that if a teacher or faculty member recommends or suggests a service for your child, that the school is responsible for supply, like providing that service?
Yeah, at least in Illinois. So any like a parent or the student themselves, or if you have like an advocate or a teacher or anyone in the building can request an evaluation for a student. You can even have some like community support agencies offer that as well. And so if any of those people request it, that counts as requesting an evaluation. And then ultimately, it just depends on what ends up in the document at the end. And so if there's, a teacher, maybe, this is the only classroom we see this kind of difficulty in. And so the other teachers don't know to suggest something. Well, that teacher does, and they're going to suggest it. And it's totally okay if that ends up in that document, even if it's just for one particular setting or something like that.
Okay. And then can you request certain services that your child receives that is not that they did not include in that IEP or 504? Like, for example, you want your child to have OT services, occupational therapy services, or like to see the social worker or the psychologist. Can you, as a parent, request that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Typically, that would be determined during the evaluation process. So that's why a lot of those people are included. But like
Mhm.
maybe the psychologist or social worker saw something and was like, oh, maybe this is an OT issue, right? We didn't really know going into it that that was part of it. They can definitely include those people then in that evaluation process. And then, if after the IEP is finalized, if a parent or a teacher even is like, hey, it looks like maybe, a handwriting motor issue or something like that has come up that we didn't actually know before. Um, can we loop in an OT and see what they think for this? Absolutely. And a lot of the times, all the school has to do is you can meet with the parents and do an addendum to the IEP or the 504 and include those services in there that way. You don't have to have like a whole other official process.
Excellent, thank you. So we do have a couple questions from the audience. Are there markers of when an IEP or 504 would be most beneficial or appropriate?
That's tricky. Um, Typically, districts will have it used to be called RTI, so response to intervention. Now it's typically called MTSS or multi-tiered system of supports. And that's like their pre-special ed or 504 sort of intervention system. And so what they'll do is they'll have maybe some teachers or someone highlight, oh, hey, this student struggles with this or struggles with this. Sometimes it's behavior, sometimes it's like, oh, they're just like academically, they really struggle with whatever subject it is. And they'll start that sort of data collection within that MTSS process. And they will sort of strategically implement additional supports that they can without crossing over into special ed territory. But at some point, you hit a limit, right? We've tried a few things and it's been maybe a month or two or even longer. The minimum for data collection is typically 5 weeks of school. Um, and so they collected all their data and they tried a few things like, hey, these aren't really working, or maybe they're working, but not as well as we would like. And so we need maybe something a little bit more supportive. We need more of a wraparound type approach. We need to include more people in some of these, or we need expertise from more of like a special ed staff or a service provider that we can't get without special ed or 504 plans. Um, and so that's when they can they'll go through that process. And at the end, if that is the case, then they'll go, okay, um, we tried all of that. Now we can go through and say, all right, hey, let's do an evaluation for something, an IEP or a 504, and see that maybe if that's the better route to go for this student. And so in terms of like markers, there can be a lot of different things. It can be behavioral, especially, if you have a younger kid and maybe there's a history of ADHD in the family, or in my line of work, maybe there's just parents who look at their kids and go, hey, I did that when I was little. And you're like, I bet you did. And they didn't, they just don't know it yet. But the teachers have a pretty good idea. Teachers, even when I wasn't one for that long, when I was, you get a pretty good feel for like, I don't know exactly what's going on here, but I know there's something. And that's often what starts the process of like, hey, this kid is going to need help doing something. I'm not exactly sure why, but I can see it. Um, and so that's where some of those like markers might start. Um, maybe they have a lot of trouble just sitting still. Maybe they have some sort of delays in their speech or their language, or like things that you might not recognize they're behind on until they get into classrooms full of other students that you can compare them to, and things like that. And that's when you kind of go, okay, maybe we're going to start tracking some of this in a more formal way and see where that takes us. Um, Even later on in school, maybe 504s can definitely be much more like temporary in their nature. And so sometimes if a student has parents going through separation or divorce, or a family member died or something like that, and they need some more intensive but temporary supports, a 504 can be implemented for things like that.
Very good. Yeah, that's a tricky one. I have another question. Starts off with, thank you. This has been great. And I wish I knew this before 504 meetings last year. Of course, don't we all?
Yeah.
On RSPs, can we ask for reading specialist support for a middle schooler with ADHD, but not a documented reading disorder, but struggles with reading?
So reading support for a kid with ADHD, but not
And
like
And
a
then there's this
learning
is a two-part
disability.
question, so I'll let you get to that one too
Yeah. So
first.
they have ADHD. We know that much, and that's documented. But then we also want to ask for reading support, but maybe they don't have like a learning disability related to reading in that case. You absolutely. Um, and it would ultimately come down to like what is contributing to that difficulty reading. Is it like, well, this particular student's ADHD manifests in like they have a really hard time focusing and paying attention, and maybe that's part of it. Is that they have a really hard time sitting still for certain amounts of time, or maybe they're just super disorganized. And like, okay, well, maybe we go through the ADHD side of it first, see if that's impacting the reading. Um, but if all of that is supported adequately and like we don't see struggles in other subjects, because every subject requires reading to a degree, if we don't see that elsewhere, then we go, okay, they need some reading support very clearly. And so parents can absolutely request, like, hey, I'm sure the teacher would also point out they're struggling with some of these things that are more reading intensive, or maybe it's not the reading, maybe it's reading and then writing responses or writing papers or writing whatever it might be, and going through like they need some help. And sometimes, depending on the grade level or the setting, that can be like, all right, we're going to put like access to maybe tutoring during lunch, or maybe we're going to incorporate like a study hall or a resource type class in their schedule in a high school setting. If it's below that, they can be like, all right, maybe since they already have an IP or a 504, we're going to also have them work with the groups of kids who do get more reading support automatically already and see how it goes. And maybe if they're working with a smaller group of students in a much more, not like one-on-one, but small group, and then maybe in a separate setting, even, or just a separate part of the classroom, maybe that helps part of it too. And then that staff member, usually a special ed teacher, will get a pretty good handle on, all right, what's going on here? And if they figure out like, yeah, there's some sort of reading difficulty here that we just didn't see before, yeah, then let's get like a reading interventionist or someone on board and as part of their treatment essentially.
And then basically the same question, except for her other child who is wondering OT services for an elementary student with ADHD for handwriting support. Says all the work teacher writes on, so it can't be read. But at the 504, they said it was for sensory concerns, but that they couldn't provide that through the school, and that both already have 504 plans.
Okay, so this then this student has a 504 plan for also ADHD. And some of it is, it seems like there's like a motor issue with their writing where it's not very legible. Um, you can absolutely ask for OT services. And just like kind of how I pointed out, it's up to the team to say this is what the student needs, not what can we offer them. Right? We want to make sure that, well, if he needs some sort of handwriting intervention or support that he's not getting, and maybe that's from an OT, that is definitely something within their wheelhouse to work on, is that motor control within the school setting. And that's part of what separates school OTs from more like a clinical setting OT. Um, they can absolutely have access to that. And that's where like it seems like you already have plenty of evidence, right? If the teacher's writing on all of these papers or whatever, I can't read this. Well, clearly there's something there. And with ADHD, yeah, there could be sensory things. It could be like maybe we try different like writing instruments or like the grips that you can add to writing instruments or whatever. Let's try some of these interventions first and see how they work. I'm assuming if the teacher's writing all of that, they've probably tried some of those already. If they haven't, though, that's definitely the route they can take. And then if those things don't really address the problem, okay, maybe there is a motor issue, and you can request an evaluation from the school's OT. You can do that formally through like the IEP evaluation process. Hey, I want an evaluation. Or you can see if the school will do it through like an addendum. That way, that doesn't have to be like a whole long process. They can just try to be like, hey, the teacher noticed this, parents noticed this. We know there's something going on. We've tried all of these things. We want to loop in an OT. Tell us what you think. It can be that sort of thing too.
So basically for either of those, they can just request that in writing and say, I believe my child would benefit from these services. Okay.
Absolutely. And it's all like direct it to the right person is your key, right? Your depending on the grade level, right? Your content or your gen ed teacher, probably not the person to send that to, although they will definitely have a good idea of all of those things that are going on. The person you want to direct it to is probably the either the special ed teacher who works with them, or in this case, like the 504 coordinator who is responsible for maintaining their 504, who you meet with every year, or you should meet with every year. You probably direct it towards them. And if not, there's probably someone who like oversees all of the different 504 coordinators in the district or whatever that person too.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I think that's all the questions that we have for tonight. I think that's a great place to stop. Thank you so much, Matthew. This has been invaluable information. If it's okay with you, we can share the PowerPoint with all the attendees or just the highlights. So look out for an email from me with the resources that were included in tonight's presentation, and I'll send out a link to the recording when that's available as well. So thank you so much, Matthew Patton from New Day Counseling. Thank you so much, and everyone have a great night.
You're welcome. Thank you.